What up? Welcome back to Sexton Accountability. Today I'm going to tell a story about my grandma who passed away, okay? She was the biggest hippie, biggest stoner that I ever knew. She was the only person that could keep up with me as far as smoking J's, just taking J's to the face back to back, okay? Eating edibles, growing cannabis. Like, dude, we did it all right? And so I grew up in that culture. So I'm uniquely qualified to talk about cannabis and also cannabis use disorder. So that's why if you've seen some of my other content, I talk about cannabis use disorder because usually it's outsiders that are talking about it and they're just like hating on it or coming from like religious, like self-righteous place, and that's not the case with me. So that's why I talk about the negatives. But today I'm going to tell you some fun times. I'm going to tell you about the encounters I had. I'm going to tell you about just a lot of, just funny stories and just encounters I had with my grandma. All right. So my grandma, her name was Molly. She moved to Austin from California, and she moved here in the late '60s. And so Austin is heavily influenced by hippie culture. At this point, it's just taken over by people from California and like the tech industry and stuff like that. But like I got to experience, sorry, there's a cat hair on my face. I got to experience like what people would call old Austin, to where it was just extremely chill here. Uh, the pace was very slow, very mellow, and just low key. All right. So growing up, I was always around music festivals, concerts. I grew up in bars. My dad is a musician. My uncle is a musician. So I would go to bars as literally a little kid, like a toddler, and then preteen, and then teenager. I would be in nightclubs and bars all the time. So that was one side of my upbringing. The other side was like more hippie. So like, going out in nature, camping, like gatherings of people that smoke a lot of weed or consume cannabis. I went to a commune multiple times with my grandma. You know what I mean? So like cannabis was like very prevalent in my life. It was very just there. It was normalized. So I always viewed it as normal. To me, it was like even more normal than alcohol because it was just more prevalent. And so at a very young age, I was always around cannabis smoke. I would constantly be in rooms that were hot boxed. So like I would be in a room and basically be inhaling cannabis. People want to say that doesn't do anything. Yeah, it does. I remember. Okay, so if you're in like a completely smoked out room, like yeah, it's going to affect a little kid. And I'm not saying this to be, judgmental or negative, but that's what I grew up in. So I remember when I was very, very little feeling the effects of cannabis from being in a room where everyone was taking fat rips out of a bong and the door was closed. All right. So this happened multiple times. Then my mom basically was like, yo, you need to stop doing that with him in the room. So then I felt like isolated, and that's a whole nother story. I do think that parents that consume cannabis need to be a lot more mindful of how it's psychologically affecting their kids, because kids are smart and they can basically realize like, that their parents are like prioritizing something and basically hiding from them. It's also a little bit sketchy if you're like consuming it to where it can have a secondhand effect on them. So there's two sides to that. But let's get into like, I went all accountable and serious here. Let's get into some of these experiences that I'm talking about. So, when I first started consuming cannabis, I would like hide it out at my grandma's house. I would go out there and literally they would be stoned and smoking, and I would like hide it, and I would like wait till nighttime to smoke. And then finally, like I remember, some other family members and my grandma were like, "Why are you like hiding this? Like, just like chill on the couch," you know what I mean? And so, I basically started doing that. We grew a lot, so we did outdoor grows and then we would do indoor grows. And she was always so impatient that she would try to like literally multiple times she tried to like put flour in the oven to dry it out. So you know what I mean? It was trial and error, and it took a lot of patience in order for her to actually let it hang and cure and then like put it in a jar and stuff like that. So that was part of my upbringing. On various occasions, other family members would send packs in the mail, and so there'd be like a pound showing up in the mail. And my grandma would end up like opening it and being like, we can just take like one nug or something. And then the family member would be like, no, like don't take any of it, like don't even open it. And you know what I'm saying? So shit like that. I always helped my grandma to get like swag, like brick weed, so I could get QPs of it. And yeah, I would just get her a QP of it for really cheap. Sometimes when I would just want to buy some cheap stuff, she would have access to it as well. There was a person out in her neighborhood that grew, and she called it Betweenika, which doesn't make any sense. She was basically saying it was like between indica and sativa, which would basically be a hybrid, but like that terminology wasn't what she used. It was basically mid. It was just like mids, but for the price of like swag. And so I would get that sometimes and basically just like roll up fat J's or like blunts with it. She lived by a lake, so we would go down to the lake and chill. Like I said, we'd go camping. We would do stuff like that. On one occasion, a family member came through after bucking and trimming in Colorado and literally had a ball of hash that was this big and broke a huge piece off of it. At least, I want to say at least like an ounce, and was like, here, and just gave it to me, literally. I grew up around that. That same person gave me literally ounce of mushrooms before. Just that's the culture that I grew up in. And I'm not saying this to brag. I'm just telling you that is what I grew up in. And on various occasions, we would just chill at my grandma's house, just roll J's all night. She had a little bubbler, stuff like that. I would end up being able to find hash, and she really loved hash. So we would, roll up little snakes and put them in J's and stuff like that. And so, that was, my experience with my grandma. My step grandpa smokes cannabis as well. My grandpa on the other side smokes cannabis as well. I grew cannabis with him as well. So yeah, that's what I grew up in. Even like later on in life, like my mom started consuming cannabis and we smoked together and stuff like that. And look, I'm going to just be accountable and say this, that everyone hears this stuff and they think, oh, that's so cool. You smoked with your grandma. Oh, you smoked with your mom. To be completely honest, it can create a really unhealthy dynamic, just as consuming alcohol with your parents can. And I can look back fondly on all those experiences, but I can also sit here and acknowledge that it created unhealthy coping skills for me because the emphasis was on changing the way that you feel. It doesn't matter like that it was something benign and like safe like cannabis. It still created a unhealthy coping skill in my life. So that's just the truth of the matter. But yeah, look, I had a lot of great times, with her. She ended up continuing to consume cannabis after having multiple strokes, and that was causing issues because she was prioritizing consuming cannabis more so than like her recovery. And to be quite honest, she was basically like done with living. So this was really disturbing to see. Smoking something when you're having aneurysms, strokes, or brain bleeds is not good, especially if you're holding your breath. And sativa can be associated with having issues because it can increase heart rate and respiration and heartbeat and stuff like that. So, there was an occasion that she was hitting a cart and literally had another stroke after. She had multiple strokes, continued to smoke, wasn't as focused on healing, and to be completely honest, it was not helpful. And so I got to see the effects of someone consuming cannabis for 50 plus years, and it aged her prematurely. It not only mentally but physically, because smoking messes up your skin. And this isn't about aesthetics or I'm just saying so I got to see the truth around that culture, and also I got to see the benefits. So there's benefits there, but no one talks about the shit that I'm talking about right now. Straight up. No one talks about this. And I guarantee you that there'll probably be someone that hears this and thinks that I'm hating. No, that's what I witnessed. It contributed to toxic relationships in her life, not maturing, basically being an elderly person that was a teenager. And at the same time, it also made her super understanding of certain things and creative and really fun to be around. So it's these things don't have to be so one-sided. And so that's why I wanted to share this big picture. And I know I kind of used it as almost clickbait of just being I'm going to tell you about these crazy times. I wanted really to also focus on some serious stuff. And yeah, you know what I mean? That's my take. I'm a huge cannabis advocate. I support people in recovery using cannabis. I support cannabis for recreational reasons, for medical reasons. I think that specific cannabinoids could potentially replace a lot of existing pharmaceuticals. So I think cannabis is an amazing medicine, but I also think that it's not talked about with accountability, and that a lot of people in the cannabis community, they don't want to hear anything negative about it. And I understand, because there's been a lot of propaganda. So I get it, but cannabis is pretty accepted now, almost universally accepted. I know that's a little bit like extreme to say universally accepted, but it's pretty accepted. There's still dogma and stigma related to it. But for the most part, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think that it will be, completely accessible in every single state. But that's just my take. Regardless, that's it for today. Much love, y'all. Be easy out there. And don't smoke boof. If you're going to smoke cannabis, get some fire. All right. That's all I'm going to say.